And welcome back to the Gamification Report, Episode 9. We've got a great show for you again this week. This week we're going to be looking at game-based learning for primary school children, the evidence of efficacy. We're going to look at gamified training in large organizations and enterprise resource planning, serious games to improve classroom management and training, and Blackboard LMS exemplary course program, rubrics gamified with storification. Boy, that's a mouthful. Then we're going to have a little look at body image and anorexia and nervosa and VR, and finishing off our report this way, we're going to look at virtual diving and people that enter the hospitality and tourism industries and how VR can be used to expand the reach of training in these areas. We're going to start with the study this week looking the work of M. Esther del Moral Perez in 2018, and she looked at 119 students who used serious games and mini games. There was a total of 15 games that she built. And what she was looking at is what kind of aspects of learning that the gamification affected mostly. So she looked at what was called logical, mathematical, naturalistic, and linguistic abilities before and after participation in gamification projects. And in every study that she was able to complete here, she found there was a widespread difference. So there were different types of learning in the children's population that were affected by gamification. So this is one of the first studies that we're aware of in which games were used to hit different forms of intelligence. In primary education, they often talk about things such as logical, mathematical, naturalistic, or linguistic intelligences. And for example, we've left a link up here you can see, which is Moon Maths, which is a way of studying multiplication using gamification. And in her studies, she was able to show that logic improved through game-based learning more than it did in conventional classroom activities. There were 10 indicators which were used to assess increase in logical mathematical intelligence that had been determined by Del Moral, Guzman, and Fernandez in 2014. Essentially, she found that widespread growth was verified in all indicators, so that problem solving along different dimensions of learning were affected by learning games. And this is an important consideration because when we look at gamification, we have to be careful what it is we're actually measuring. Are we measuring recall, or, as we've talked about in previous broadcasts, affective domains, or are we looking at interpersonal skills or assessment? This is the first study we've looked at where different forms of processing in primary children, in primary age children, were measured in a game study. Linguistic intelligence, for example, refers to the ability to manage and structure the meanings and functions of specific words and language as a whole. Linguistic intelligence. And it's essentially a very powerful tool for communication as children learn to master vocabulary and grammar. So she developed a game, for example, called Scribble Not Saga, which demanded that participants use a broad knowledge of vocabulary. And in having to use this language in the course of playing the game, then there was a before and after difference, a total gain in this linguistic intelligence. And this idea that spoken as written language are often seen in role-playing games and narrative elements. So if we're going to develop a game for learning that uses role-playing, then the idea of linguistic intelligence is very important because the languaging and metaphors and analysis of structure occurs within a specific form of learning. We can talk about, therefore, these different games as being targeting different skills, such as reading, writing, hearing, speaking, debating, or discussion. And as I said, it's the first kind of study that's been able to tease about these multiple impacts of game-based learning across different forms of intelligence. This idea of developing multiple intelligence after Cook's work in 2012 was really clearly evidenced. And essentially what happened in these games to unite them was that they recreated stories which were narrated by attractive characters who encouraged the students, in this case the players, to work hard, and promoting calculation of elements relating to a script, and the aim of solving problems in a playful nature. So we can use game-based learning to hit different forms of intelligence in children, and there's no reason to think that we cannot extrapolate this data to working with adults. The next paper we're going to look at is the work of Isabel Arcevar and Andreas Abad in 2016. And this paper discussed how to improve gamified systems across large organizations such as enterprise resource planning systems, We're not so interested in this broadcast about enterprise resource planning per se, but how do you develop a gamified system for teaching large numbers of employees in very complex systems such as you see in major banks, where you have many different levels of process and control and training which are ongoing and have to be synchronized. So in this case, they chose these because the enterprise resource planning system, ERP system, is seen as a digital nerve system of organizations, providing information to customers and suppliers. And what's interesting here, in Redig's study in 2017, which they cite, over 75% of these implementations were considered to be a failure. So you can spend a lot of money trying to build out very large training management systems in something like a large bank, which may have 40 or 50,000 employees, and that a lot of these implementations are considered a failure. This is the kind of argument we hear from clients all the time, that very intensive training programs across large organizations fail to have traction. And this may have something to do with this idea of curricular sclerosis. It's a term we like to use. And that is that the idea that end users often receive insufficient training. And we know what happens in large training organizations where you would look at a major bank or major department store chain. You might have lack of commitment from senior management to the training materials. You might have an inability to introduce new concepts into legacy systems which have their own ways that they function. You might have members of the team that have taken training but fail to act on the training. We see this very often in industry. And the failure of redesign and business process and commitment with change. Does it sound familiar? I think it would for any of you working in large organizations. When we look at the kind of data, was training sufficient? In most cases, people say at the end of these very large scale, and remember, you can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on these projects. And in most cases, there's an overall feeling the training was insufficient most of the time. And that many people need different types of training, but that end users, as you can see here, about 49% require the most training in these systems, and that executives frequently don't require the training. The training is seen in the end user environment. So again, we have this constant statistic that emerges in the literature where very large, expensive attempts to move up customer service and other supplies of new services and resources and organizations can be stymied by the lack of initiation and uptake on training. Westjet Airlines completed a large gamification project using an ERP system to increase the use of the system. And the Westjet pilot project focused on expense reports process, and they were able to look of corporate credit cards and personal credit cards, attachments of receipts to expense reports. None of it is Einsteinian rediscovering the wheel, but it is the lifeblood of where a corporate training occurs. It's these very detailed procedural elements. So Westjet was one of the earliest adopters in its pilot project and had some impressive results. And there are so many kinds of aspects to any kind of training process, and I think these would be familiar to you, any of you working in industry, where that you have dynamics, and then you have mechanics in an industry, and then you have the components. So as you can see, if we look at this part of the screen here, these are the dynamics of a game system. There would be emotions, progress, and storytelling and social interaction. We want to build these into the training process. And again, just remember, this lies in contrast to simply mailing PDFs out to 30,000 employees and hoping to see any real uptake of training or change. Then there would be the mechanical aspect of gamifying large-scale training, which would include the use of challenges, random elements, cooperation, feedback, and rewards. And then the actual components of gamified training, as we can see at the bottom, are terminology that I think you're becoming familiar with. The use of points to denote progress, achieving different levels, having one-time achievements, going on missions, receiving badges, developing an avatar, developing leaderboards, progress bars, and performance stars. So when these three elements of dynamics and mechanics and components are built into a system such as Westjet employed, then you have a much more effective gamified system. And in this one study, another study they quote in the paper is industrial engineering students, in which they compared non-gamified training to gamified training in two different experimental situations. And they were able to show that through using satisfaction surveys and final test and diagnostic tests, they saw appreciable gains using the game-based environments. So essentially, what we would see is that the second group showed better results with respect to user learning and satisfaction. So again, there's a lot of theory about how games could be effective for producing large-scale organizational changes in practice and activities. But when you look at this in detail, there have not been a lot of quantitative data to support these, so this is very useful here. We're now going to look at another little study, which I think breaks it down. We're going to kind of jump from the very big picture of trying to produce training in very large organizations to look at very simple activities we can use in classrooms. And this is a good way to get started in gamification, which is coin-based gamification. And this is a paper by John Carlson, Renita Harris, and Ken Harris, 2017 at the Indiana State University. And the course here was in how to code. So you had people learning how to do, basic coding, for mobile devices, etc. So each classroom activity related to coding resulted in a coin reward of what they called doubloons. And so each task they completed, they accumulated different kinds of currency. So as you're paying the people to learn, as it were, in the game using some kind of monopoly money, you're essentially creating an in-game economy. And then there were different ways that you could use the money. So once you completed a coding activity, perhaps building a GUI interface for users, or perhaps putting files for learning or some kind of learning activity in the mobile device, you would then gain coins. Now, the important thing here is to be able to use the coins for something in the game. So for example, they could erase an absence in this case. So that could be that the student was able to skip a lab day because they had enough coins to use this. And we've talked about our colleague, Professor Deb Fells at Ryerson University, that uses a virtual form of Bitcoin. And the Bitcoin can be used to purchase things in her university course, such as exemptions from certain learning activities or extensions on assignments. They could also boost a homework check score. They could exchange coins for use in other class or buying credits in the final exams. So you could, for example, do activities in the course and be rewarded with coins and be able to have your final exam worth less because what you'd done in the course had made up for it. So it was really interesting to see how you can just simply use the coin-based economy and reward players with coins, and then use the coins to allow people to manipulate their participation in the course. There are negatives to using coin-based training, we've talked about here, and this is the investment of time. So when you have to set up some kind of game system, you have to think about how much time it takes. If you had 700 students in your class and you wanted to reward them with different types of coins, then you'd have to track 700 students' resource economies. But here at Humber College, for example, classes are capped at between 40 to 70 students, in many cases capped at 40 students. And in that case, it's not difficult, again, to do what, again, our colleague Deborah Fells is doing, where you spend a little bit of time after each class tracking down what coins that students earn and how to move forward with it. So it's interesting how adding this element of an in-game economy allows students to parcel their learning and administer it. The next I'm going to look at here, and this is an interesting one, is hybrid gamification by someone named Simon Majowski. And we're producing some videos in this area of using learning management systems. So there's an exemplary course model used for Blackboard Learn. Blackboard Learn is one of the most commonly used learning management systems in the world. And in this study, they essentially developed a MyGame gamification mobile app that integrated with Blackboard Learn. So while you're in the learning management system, you could click on this app and enter these game environments. They then integrated Kahoot, Amazon, Alexa, Google Traveler, Twitter, and others. And so it was really trying to develop some kind of way to use a learning management system integrated with other game elements to pick up and spice up your LMS experience. So Blackboard Learn was therefore used as the game architecture. And this is very interesting here because many of you that are watching this don't have the resources to build game systems. But if you can learn how to use your learning management system as a learning game, then this is an exemplary practice that Blackboard supports and Desire to Learn, D2L, and Moodle, etc. So here we're going to introduce this concept of storification. And storification is a nice word. It's turning things into a story, essentially. And what it does is it allows this element of unpredictability, that you not know what's going to happen in a narrative. You're curious to find out. So, for example, in this coding case, they had historical events and Viking folk stories, which were used to introduce computer principles during lectures. Computer hacking was likened to a Viking raid. The internet was explained in terms of a river and sea connectivity for the Vikings in the medieval world. And then there was a compilation of these stories, which was available through the Amazon Alexa skill prepared for the course, called Computer Storified in Viking History by Floki. And then they built this into the game mobile app. So you get into the learning management system, but then you click on the app within the system to bring it forward and to access these storification elements. So we're going to take this from the start again. So storification is an interesting word that we want to discuss here, and that is the idea of turning things into stories. And that adds a measure of unpredictability, which allows for capturing the imagination through a narrative. Narratives are so much more interesting for us than straight facts. We are human stories. Historical events and Viking folk stories were used in this case to introduce computer principles. For example, computer hacking was likened to Viking raids. The internet was explained in terms of river and sea connectivity for Vikings in a medieval world. A compilation of these stories were then made available through the Amazon Alexa skill prepared for the course called Computer Storified. So what they essentially did in this case to show exemplary practice is that you have your learning management system, but then you click on an icon within the LMS that takes you into an app, and then the app adds a story element to engage the learning. And it was just very, very interesting how he approached it. So again, I want you to try to think of including this idea of storification in your thinking about gamification. And you don't even need to think about gamification to use storification. And good lecturers do tell stories, but I know it was many years I taught in biological sciences without essentially telling stories. They were lists and lists and lists of pathological conditions and anatomical terms. And one day one of my medical students slammed her books on the table and just said, "This is so boring, all you're doing is regurgitating the textbook." And the whole class turned around and looked at her in horror. And I looked at her in horror and realized that she was right, that I really had to begin to couch all of my teaching in the terms of building a story and a narrative. And it's amazing how much more impact you have when you develop it. So that was the underlying theme of gamification here. So this course, Introduction to Computing at Grand Valley State, was their next project, and that received the Blackboard Exemplary Course Award in 2017. Over time, a steady growth of enrollment in the course was recorded, with over 1,500 students in 2013, 1,600, and by 2016, over 1,700 students. This was then reviewed by what's called the Blackboard Exemplary Course Program reviewers, and then the final course was then reviewed, utilized by another 874 students to look at it, and it was then implemented over different semesters. So again, there's a lot of detail. Of course, it's a research report, so we want you to be able to look at the numbers. But it's interesting that here we took a simple learning management system, and by using this idea of bolt-on design. So what bolt-on design means in gamification is that you can essentially add a game to your learning that can be pulled from the learning or added at any point. Now, I have mixed feelings about bolt-on design. We've certainly worked across different industries, across Canada with different partners from coast to coast. So again, to understand, bolt-on design is where you have a course that's basically running on a learning management system, but then you have these elements that can be brought in and used to teach a certain part of the course using games. There's a danger in bolt-on design in that the games can be bypassed in favor of the person simply jumping to the learning, and therefore the benefits of game-based learning, which we try to emphasize in this series, may not be seen as well. But at the same point, bolt-on training is probably a really good way to get yourself started in it. But again, make it clear that bolt-on design and gamification does not mean simply adding Kahoot or adding a little Jeopardy type quiz game. It's actually adding a significant chunk of content to the game, to the learning within a learning management system, and then being able to use that as a powerful tool, not just to enhance learning, but to base learning, so that the student has some options of using the game to work in more difficult concept areas. So again, I'm not so sure I like the bolt-on idea because we fought so hard to establish game-based learning, serious games as the foundation of training. But at the same point, I think a one-size-fits-all is a very bad way to look at anything. And many of you working in the field will want to use bolt-on designs. Another study that they looked at here, that we want to look at here, is occurs in the area of virtual reality. And one study we looked at had to do with virtual reality and augmented reality and visual disturbances in the body. So this now is looking at VR in a kind of a different concept. This is looking at anorexia nervosa. And this was an interesting study, kind of departing into games and looking more at VR. This was a study in which they looked at 24 women with anorexia nervosa compared to 24 controls. And they performed a three-dimensional body scan, and they created realistic virtual 3D bodies for each participant. And avatars were presented in a virtual reality mirror scenario. And doing different physical tests, participants were able to identify and adjust their actual desired body weight. So this is a study looking at using VR to create an image of the body for the management of anorexia nervosa. And women with both anorexia nervosa and controls underestimated their weight, with the trend that women with anorexia nervosa underestimated more. We know that the average woman, at least in Canada, by the time she's about 18 years old, has very negative views of her body, and by the time she's in her mid-20s, there's almost 70% of women. So this study, in which you look at anorexia nervosa, looks at the use of virtual reality to modify a body image. And what they found was for relatively profound results that in the study was able to show with VR that there was a widespread assumption that we have that patients with anorexia nervosa overestimate their body weight due to visual distortions. But in this case, it didn't have anything to do with the visual distortions, because in VR they could render the visual distortions, but those were disconnected. So that in fact, this body identity disorder, this kind of body image disorder, was driven by distorted attitudes with respect to the body. So it was very interesting here, able to use VR to create the body that you think you have in the mirror with anorexia nervosa, and able to see that manipulation of that form manipulation of the body weight with the VR image didn't actually change attitudes. It was actually the attitude toward the body that emerged in the study. So this stuff is really exciting, the way it's beginning to develop. And the last part of the broadcast we want to look at today is, again, looking at virtual reality and virtual diving to take us into the area of tourism. And we don't really mean that kind of diving, we mean the underwater diving. So Bruno Fabio, and published in June 2018, that's just a very recent journal, is the idea of a virtual diving system based on VR application. And this is the idea that you're going to be able to book virtual vacations in the future. And I know this sounds kind of weird, but that's kind of where people are going. So can you actually become a scuba diver in VR, and can you have a storyline that's developed that, and then you have a virtual diving companion that travels with you as you explore an underwater archaeological site? And very interesting stuff, what we call virtual tourism. So essentially, the virtual diving system provided general historical cultural contents, but also the flora and fauna of the submerged site. So you can be in this virtual world in a dive suit, traveling underwater, and then you can insert flora and fauna and other archaeological data so that it makes a more complete experience. And the proposed VR system was able to provide quite a playful learning experience in its early pilots. And I just want to look back here. In order to do this, they used acoustic bathymetry combined with optical and aerial data. So essentially, what they did is they had divers wearing the camera to take VR images, swimming at an average distance of about 1.5 meters above the site. And as they did it, that acquired overlapping transects along straight lines that covered the entire area. And then they used another optical and aerial data to compile it, and they produced a data set of 1,200 images. And when they were finished it, they had the ability to move someone into a completely virtual diving experience, which was informed by being able to insert relevant learning information. And I think this ability mobility, I think we can think of all kinds of great applications for this. Imagine magnificent journeys where we can go inside the human bloodstream and travel to the brain and travel through the blood vessels, or maybe travel through outer space. This idea of using composite data from the real world, building it into the virtual world to give a much more complete and robust experience. That's all we have for you this week. I hope you found it useful. We'll see you next week. This is David Chandross, the Center of Teaching and Learning here at Humber College. Have a great week.